I've always loved hiking alone. The silence, the sense of being completely disconnected from everything. It's what makes me feel alive. No notifications, no traffic, no distractions. Just me and the wilderness. That's why, when I had a long weekend off work, I decided to take on a remote trail in the mountains. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, but this one was different. It was deeper into the wilderness, not as well traveled. That's what made it exciting. I packed light but smart. Just enough food for 2 days, extra layers, a small tent, my sleeping bag, my knife, a good GPS, and a paper map as a backup. I checked the weather. No storms, no rain. Everything should have gone smoothly. Didn't. The trail started out perfect. The air was crisp, the sun was warm but not too hot, and the forest smelled fresh. The path was narrow but well-marked, winding through tall trees. I made good time, stopping only to drink water and take a few photos. After a few miles, the forest started to change. The trees grew denser, taller, their branches intertwining above me, blocking out the sun. The ground was soft, covered in thick moss. The air felt colder. It wasn't unsettling, just different. I actually liked it. Then I saw something strange. A single hiking boot sitting off to the side of the trail. It was old, the leather cracked, laces frayed. It looked like it had been there for years. I nudged it with my foot, thinking maybe someone had lost it a long time ago. A little further up, I saw another. Then a torn backpack, half buried in the dirt. Its contents were spilled out. An old jacket, a rusted can of food, a map, its edges curling from moisture. It had been there a while, but not long enough to be unrecognizable. Something about it made me uneasy. People don't just leave their gear behind like that. If you lose a backpack in the wilderness, you go back for it. Unless something prevents you from doing so. I shook the thought away. Maybe it belonged to a hiker who had an emergency and had to leave quickly. It didn't mean anything. I kept moving. A few more miles in, I reached the river. It was shallow but wide, rushing over smooth rocks. My map showed a bridge, but when I got there, it was gone. Probably washed away in a storm. I'd have to wade across. The water was ice cold, stronger than I expected. I stepped carefully, feeling for steady rocks beneath my boots. Halfway across, my foot hit something solid. Not a rock, something softer. I looked down. A backpack. It was wedged between two rocks, half submerged. Unlike the other one, this one looked newer. The fabric was still bright. The zippers weren't rusted. I pulled it free and set it on the riverbank. It was heavy. I unzipped it. Inside, I found a sleeping bag, a water bottle, a phone, dead, and a wallet. I opened the wallet. There was an ID inside. A guy in his 30s. His name was Mark. The food inside the bag wasn't that old. Maybe a few weeks at most. Someone had left this here recently. I looked around. The forest was silent. Where was Mark? I left the bag where it was and kept moving. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was setting. The view was incredible. Rolling mountains stretching out forever, the river snaking through the valley below. I should have felt at peace, but something felt wrong. That backpack, the abandoned gear. If Mark lost his bag in the river, he had to be close by. But there was no sign of him. I set up my tent and made a small fire. Ate my food in silence. The air felt heavier, thicker. I listened. Nothing. No wind. No rustling leaves. No night sounds at all. That wasn't normal. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then something pressed against the tent wall. A hand? A knee? It was firm, pushing in just slightly, then pulling away. I gripped my knife. I waited. Nothing. After what felt like hours, I finally unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. Nothing. I barely slept after that. The first light, I packed up and started moving. Fast. I didn't care about the view anymore. I just wanted to be out of there. The forest felt different on the way down. Darker, like the trees were closing in. Then I saw them. Footprints. fresh ones in the damp earth. Not mine. Someone had been following me. I didn't stop. I didn't drink water. I didn't rest. I just moved. And then, the boot. The same one I had seen on the way up. Except now it was in the middle of the trail. I hadn't touched it before. I knew I hadn't. Someone had moved it. I kept going. Faster. The silence was crushing. No birds, no wind. Just my breathing, my footsteps. Then a head movement. A shape deep in the trees. Tall. Still. Watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I moved faster than I ever had before. I made it back to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The trees stood still, the trail empty, but I knew someone had been there. Someone had followed me, and they were still out there. I've always prided myself on being a careful hiker. I plan my routes, carry the right gear, and make sure someone knows where I'm going. But no amount of preparation can account for the unknown. And what happened to me last fall is something I still struggle to explain. I haven't been back on the trails since. I had set out for a 4-day solo hike through a remote stretch of national forest. This wasn't some marked trail or popular hiking route. This was deep, isolated wilderness. No cell service, no signs, no help. That was the appeal. I wanted solitude. I parked my truck at a small pull-off where an old fire road led into the trees. According to my maps, that road would take me a few miles in before disappearing, and from there I'd be on my own. I loaded up my pack, double-checked my gear, and started walking. The first day went exactly as planned. The terrain was tough, but I made good progress. I hiked through dense forest, following faint game trails, crossing small streams, climbing ridges. By late afternoon, I found a good spot to camp, a small clearing near a creek. I set up my tent, ate a quick meal, and sat by my small fire as the sun dipped below the trees. It was quiet, peaceful, exactly what I had come for. I slept soundly that night. The next morning, I packed up and continued deeper into the forest. My plan was to loop around a large ridge, then descend into a valley where an old logging road should still exist. I followed what I thought was the right path, moving steadily through the trees. But after a few hours, something felt off. The terrain didn't match my map. I should have been descending, but I was still climbing. The trees were denser than they should have been. I checked my GPS. No signal. I pulled out my compass. The needle spun erratically. I told myself it was fine. I could navigate without them. But a small pit of unease settled in my stomach. I decided to adjust my course, cutting west toward lower ground. I pushed through the underbrush, expecting to find the ridge I was supposed to be skirting. Instead, I found something else. The trees thinned, opening up into a small clearing. And in the center of it, there was a structure. Not a cabin, not a shack, just a wall. A single wall, made of old, rotting wood, standing alone in the middle of the wilderness. There were no other signs of a building, no foundation, no debris, just that wall. I walked around it, my skin crawling. Something about it felt wrong. I didn't touch it. I didn't go near it. I just turned and walked the other way, moving quickly, trying to shake the sudden, overwhelming feeling that I was somewhere I shouldn't be. I didn't stop until I was deep into the trees again. I hiked fast for the next few hours, trying to make sense of my position. But nothing was making sense. The map didn't match the terrain. The landmarks I was supposed to be seeing weren't there. And worse, I wasn't alone. It started as a feeling. Then came the sounds. Branches breaking, leaves rustling, the subtle, rhythmic crunch of footsteps that weren't mine. I stopped, turned, scanned the trees. Nothing. I kept moving. A few minutes later, the sound again. Closer, pacing me. I gripped my knife, my heart pounding. I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there. By the time I made camp, I was exhausted. But I couldn't shake the unease. I set up my tent, but I didn't start a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. The woods were eerily quiet again. Then, just as I was settling in, a sound. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. A low, deliberate whistle. Not the wind, not an animal, person. I sat there, frozen, my breathing shallow. Then, after a long silence, another whistle, closer. I gripped my knife and sat in the dark, waiting. It didn't come again, but I didn't sleep. The first light, I packed up and started moving, fast. I didn't care about the loop anymore. I just needed to get out. I followed the sun, trying to work my way back toward my truck. The feeling of being watched never left me. Then, around mid-morning, a footprint, not mine, fresh, deep in the mud, barefoot. My skin crawled. I forced myself to keep moving, pushing through the exhaustion, through the growing sense of dread. Then, just ahead, something hanging from a tree. I stopped. It was my marker, a small strip of orange fabric I had tied to a branch yesterday. I had been here before. I was going in circles. Panic set in. I was officially lost. I took off downhill, moving as fast as I could. I tripped, stumbled, cut my arm on a branch. Then, a noise behind me, a rustling, a shape. I ran. Branches whipped past me, my pack slowing me down. I didn't look back. I just ran. Then, suddenly, a break in the trees. A road, the fire road where I had started. I stumbled onto it, gasping for breath, my legs shaking. I turned. Nothing. The woods were still. But I knew without a doubt I had been followed. I sprinted to my truck, threw my pack inside, and tore out of there, gravel spraying behind me. I went back a week later, not alone. With a team, we searched for the wall. It wasn't there. The path I had taken didn't exist. I still don't know what happened out there, but I do know this: I'm never hiking alone again. I've always loved hiking alone. Something about the quiet, the escape from people, and the feeling of being completely on my own in the wild. It's addictive. I've done it for years, always careful, always prepared. I bring the right gear, I plan my routes, and I follow the rules. But this time, I made mistakes, and I almost didn't make it back. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day hike in a remote part of the mountains. No marked trails, just a mix of old logging roads and game trails. I had spent weeks planning it. I had topo maps, a GPS, and a compass. Everything I needed. The weather was perfect, clear, cool, no rain in the forecast. I parked my truck on a quiet dirt road where the trailhead used to be years ago, before the Park Service stopped maintaining it. I slung my pack over my shoulders, locked the truck, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The forest was thick, but the air was fresh, and I kept a steady pace. No signs of people, just the way I liked it. Around noon, I stopped for water and checked my map. I was ahead of schedule, but something felt off. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the distant sound of the wind, high in the trees. I shook it off and kept moving. A few miles later, I found an old fire road. It wasn't marked on my map, but it was wide and clear. It looked easier than the rough terrain I'd been climbing. So I took it. First mistake. After an hour on the road, I found something strange. An old cabin. It wasn't supposed to be there. I had studied the maps, checked satellite images. There were no buildings out here. But there it was. Small, old, half hidden by trees. I stood there staring at it. The door was missing, the windows were smashed, and the smell, something rotten. I should have turned around. Instead, I stepped inside. The inside was bare. No furniture. No signs that anyone had lived there in years. Just dust, dirt, and the faint, sickening smell of decay. I turned to leave. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh ones. Deep in the dust. Leading deeper into the cabin. I backed out fast, my heart hammering. I didn't run. Not yet. But I picked up my pace, heading back to where I'd left the main trail. I shouldn't have taken the fire road. I needed to get back to my planned route. But when I checked my GPS, it wasn't working. The screen flickered, the signal was gone. I pulled out my compass. The needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. I tried to stay calm. I had my map. I just needed to retrace my steps. But the more I walked, the more I realized the trail was gone. The fire road, the one I had been following, had disappeared, like it had never been there. I stopped, took a deep breath. I wasn't lost. Couldn't be. I had been following a straight path. But the trees looked different now. The terrain felt unfamiliar. The sun was getting lower. I needed to make camp. I found a small clearing and set up my tent. I forced myself to eat, even though my stomach was tight with anxiety. As the sun set, the silence returned. Then the snapping of a branch. Close, too close. I gripped my knife and sat in the dark, listening. Something was out there. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something moving. Not an animal. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling my camp. I sat there, gripping my knife, my back pressed against a tree. I waited for morning. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up fast and started moving. I just needed to find higher ground, a vantage point, but every direction looked the same. The trees, the hills. It was like the forest was changing around me. Then ahead of me, a shape, tall, still, watching. I didn't wait. I ran. I don't remember how long I ran. The branches tore at my arms. My breath burned in my chest, but I didn't stop. Then suddenly, the gravel road. I stumbled onto it, gasping for air. I turned. Nothing. The forest behind me was empty, but I knew I wasn't alone. I sprinted toward my truck, every muscle screaming. When I reached it, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. The second I was inside, I locked the doors and peeled out of there, not looking back. I never found that fire road again. I went back with a team, but it wasn't there. The cabin? Gone. Like it had never existed. But I know what I saw, and I know something was out there. I haven't hiked alone since. I never liked camping alone. There was something about being deep in the woods, miles away from anyone, that made me uneasy. But I had been doing solo camping trips for years, trying to push myself past the fear. And for the most part, I had gotten used to it. This trip was supposed to be easy. 3 nights in the backcountry, deep in a national forest that stretched for miles in every direction. No designated campsites, no trails, just thick, untouched woods. I had planned the route carefully, picked a good spot near a small stream, and packed enough supplies to last me the entire time. The drive out took half the day. I parked my truck at the edge of an old logging road, the last place any vehicle could reach. After that, it was just me and the trees. The hike was tough. The forest was thick, the undergrowth making it hard to move in some places. I had to check my map every half hour to make sure I was still on course. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant sounds of cars or people, just the wind moving through the pines and the occasional rustle of small animals in the brush. By the time I reached the spot I had marked on the map, the sun was getting low. It was perfect. A flat clearing, soft ground covered in pine needles, a small stream nearby. I dropped my pack, stretched out my sore shoulders, and got to work setting up camp. The first night was uneventful. I built a small fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat for a while, listening to the quiet. The air was cool, the smell of pine thick. I should have felt at peace, but I didn't. Something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't anything obvious. The forest just felt too still, like it was holding its breath. I ignored it, chalking it up to my usual nerves. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and forced myself to sleep. At some point in the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it, movement outside the tent. Not an animal. Something heavy, slow, careful. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps circled the tent, crunching softly over the pine needles. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to stay still. The footsteps stopped. Then nothing. I lay awake for hours, waiting, listening, but I never heard it again. By morning, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a deer, curious about the smell of food. I shook off the fear, made breakfast, and spent the day exploring the area. The second night, I stayed up later, keeping the fire going longer than before. The woods were silent, too silent. I barely slept. And then on the third night, it got worse. I woke up again. The fire had burned down to embers. The air was cold, still, and something was outside my tent. Closer this time. I could hear breathing, slow, deep breaths, just on the other side of the thin fabric. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Something pressed against the tent. A hand, not a paw, not a branch. A hand stayed there for a long time. Then, just as slowly, it pulled away. The footsteps moved back into the trees. And then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whistle, low, drawn out, like someone calling a dog. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there, waiting, heart hammering in my chest. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things and left. The hike back felt different. I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. The feeling never went away. Even when I reached my truck, even when I drove away, I felt it. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. I don't know what made me take the trip. Maybe I wanted some time alone, away from the noise of my life. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. Spend a week alone in the wilderness, miles away from anyone, with nothing but my own thoughts. I had been to the cabin once before. It belonged to an old coworker of mine, a guy named Rick who I barely kept in touch with anymore. He had inherited it from his grandfather, and since he barely used it, he told me I could borrow it any time. It was deep in the woods, about an hour's drive from the nearest paved road. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a cot, and an old outhouse a few yards behind the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by dense forest. The kind of place where, once you got there, you didn't see another person for days. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive out was uneventful. The last stretch of road was rough, just a narrow dirt path cutting through the trees. My truck's tires kicked up rocks as I made my way up the winding trail, branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle. By the time I arrived, the sun was already sinking behind the trees. I stepped out of the truck and stretched my legs, breathing in the crisp, cool air. The place looked exactly as I remembered. Weathered wood, a slanted tin roof, the front porch sagging slightly. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, dust floating in the fading sunlight that filtered through the small window. The cot was against the far wall, next to a wood-burning stove. A single wooden chair sat near the table, which still had a few old hunting knives stuck into the surface. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned goods and a few supplies Rick had left behind. I set my bag down and got to work. I swept out the dust, stacked my food neatly on the shelves, and gathered firewood from the small pile outside. The place had no generator, so I relied on lanterns and a flashlight once the sun set. The first night passed without issue. I made a fire, heated up a can of chili, and sat on the porch for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The occasional rustling in the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. No traffic noise, no hum of electricity, no voices, just silence. It was peaceful. The next morning, I decided to explore. I followed a narrow trail behind the cabin that led down to a creek. The water was clear, moving slow over smooth stones. I crouched down, splashing some of it on my face, letting the cold wake me up. I spent most of the day hiking, making my way through the thick trees, keeping my bearings by the position of the sun. By mid-afternoon, I found myself in a small, overgrown clearing. There were no trails leading to it, no signs that anyone had been there in a long time. And yet, there was something there, a structure, At first, I thought it was just another cabin, but as I stepped closer, I saw that it was something else. A shack built from old, rotting wood, leaning slightly to one side. It looked abandoned, the door hanging slightly open. I hesitated, then stepped closer. The ground in front of it was uneven, patches of grass growing up through the dirt. I pushed the door open, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness inside. The place was empty, just a small, single-room structure. The walls were bare, except for deep scratches running along the wood. The floor was covered in dead leaves, dirt, and animal droppings. I felt uneasy. There was no reason for a place like this to be out here. It wasn't a hunter's cabin. There was no stove, no furniture, just 4 walls and a roof. And those scratches, they weren't random. They were deep, deliberate, like someone had dragged something sharp across the wood over and over again. I backed out of the shack, my skin crawling. The air felt colder than before, the forest suddenly too quiet. I made my way back to the cabin faster than I intended, my footsteps crunching against the forest floor. I told myself it was nothing, just an old shack someone had built and abandoned long ago. But something about it stuck with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting weak, flickering light across the wooden walls. Then I heard it, a sound outside. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. The rifle was within arm's reach, but I didn't move. I just lay there listening. The footsteps stopped. Then, after a long pause, a soft, scraping sound, like something being dragged across wood. My throat went dry. I sat up slowly, reaching for the rifle, my fingers stiff with cold. Silence. I waited, ears straining. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the cabin. I stayed that way for what felt like hours, my body tense, my eyes locked on the door. Eventually, exhaustion won. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I opened my eyes, the first light of dawn was seeping through the window. I got up, moving cautiously to the door. When I stepped outside, I saw them, footprints, leading from the treeline to the cabin. They were human, barefoot, and they stopped just short of the porch. I felt my stomach tighten as I followed them with my eyes. They didn't lead away. Whoever had made them had walked up to the cabin, stood there for who knows how long, then vanished. I didn't hesitate. I packed my things in minutes, throwing everything into my bag, barely checking to make sure I had everything. I didn't care. I locked the cabin behind me, even though I knew it didn't matter. Whatever had been out there hadn't been trying to get inside. It had just been watching. I climbed into my truck, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The tires spun in the snow for a moment before catching, and then I was moving, the cabin disappearing behind me as I sped down the narrow dirt road. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the highway, my breathing had finally started to slow. I kept telling myself I had imagined it, that the footprints had been mine, distorted by the wind, the night playing tricks on me. But I knew the truth. Something had been out there, watching, waiting, and I had no intention of ever finding out what it wanted. Hiking the Colorado Trail with my dad was something we had been planning for a while. It wasn't the whole trail, just a section, but it was still a serious trip. Long miles, unpredictable weather, and the kind of terrain that could wear you down if you weren't prepared. I'd been hiking since I was a kid, and my dad had been the one to get me into it, so I wasn't too worried about handling the trail itself. But the wilderness always had surprises, and this trip ended up giving us one that I still think about. We had started out early in the morning, boots crunching over dirt and rock as we moved along the trail. The weather was perfect, clear blue sky, just enough breeze to keep us from sweating too much. The mountains stretched out in every direction, endless ridges fading into the distance. It felt like we were the only people out there, which was exactly what we wanted. The first couple of days were pretty routine. We hiked, set up camp, made food, and got up the next morning to do it all over again. Nothing unusual, but on the third day, things started to feel a little different. It was mid-afternoon, and we were moving through a dense section of forest. The trees presa in close on both sides of the trail, thick trunks and tangled undergrowth making it hard to see more than a few yards off the path. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The ground was soft with fallen needles, muffling our footsteps. That was when we heard it, a deep, heavy noise somewhere in the trees. At first, I wasn't sure I had even heard anything at all. It was just a low, rumbling sound, almost like the wind moving through the branches. But then it came again, louder this time, a heavy snort. I stopped walking. My dad stopped too. Moose. That was my first thought. It had to be a moose. Moose aren't like deer. They don't spook and run when they see people. They don't avoid you. They're big, they're aggressive, and they don't care if you're in their way. A bull moose in the wrong mood could turn a quiet afternoon into a serious problem fast. We moved carefully, keeping our voices low, scanning the trees ahead. The sound came again. Deep, heavy breathing, the rustling of something large moving through the undergrowth. Then we saw the tracks. They were big, too big for deer, too rounded for elk. Definitely moose. We slowed down, walking cautiously. My heart was already pounding a little harder than it should have been. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was on edge. When you're out in the middle of nowhere, miles from help, a bad encounter with wildlife isn't just a scary story. It's a real problem. Then we saw it. Through the trees, just beyond a break in the undergrowth, something large was moving. Dark, solid. A massive body shifting through the brush. Moose. Had to be. But something was off. The shape wasn't quite right. Moose had long legs, that distinctive humped back, big, awkward heads. Whatever was moving in the trees, it didn't have that shape. It was big, sure, but it was different. It stepped into the clearing. Not a moose, a cow. Just a regular, black and white cow, standing in the middle of the forest like it belonged there. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. My whole body had been braced for a moose. Heart pounding, muscles tense, every instinct telling me to be careful. And then, suddenly, I was just staring at a cow. It looked at us. We looked at it. Then it turned and wandered off into the trees, as if we weren't even there. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My dad exhaled too, shaking his head. We kept walking, and a few minutes later, we saw more of them. A whole herd. Cows just there, in the woods. It didn't make sense. There were no farms anywhere near this part of the trail.
No pastures, no ranches.
Just wilderness. And yet, here they were, a dozen or more cows, grazing in the trees like they had been there forever. For some reason, the whole thing felt weird. It wasn't like seeing a bear or hearing coyotes in the distance. That would have made sense. This didn't. We kept walking, and eventually we left them behind. The trail climbed higher, and soon we were out of the trees, moving into more open country. I don't know why that moment stuck with me the way it did. It wasn't scary, not really. It wasn't dangerous. But for some reason, I still think about those cows. Hiking alone has always been my thing. I love the quiet, the feeling of being completely cut off from everything. No emails, no phone calls, just me and the wilderness. I've done solo hikes for years and never had a reason to feel unsafe. That changed last summer. I had a long weekend coming up and wanted to try something different. I found a little-known trail online, deep in a national forest, about 30 miles out and back. It wasn't a popular route, and that's exactly what appealed to me. I wanted solitude, a chance to clear my head. The plan was simple. Hike in about 15 miles the first day, set up camp, then head back the next morning. I packed light but smart tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water, a first aid kit, and both my GPS and a paper map. Everything should have gone smoothly. Didn't. I started early, reaching the trailhead just after sunrise. The parking lot was empty, which wasn't surprising. This wasn't a well-traveled path. The first few miles were easy, the trail cutting through dense pines. The morning air was crisp, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. It was perfect. I made good time, stopping only for water breaks. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. By mile 8, the birds had gone silent. No wind, no rustling, just the sound of my own footsteps. Felt wrong, but I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. Then I saw the first sign that something wasn't right. A single hiking boot, half buried in the dirt beside the trail. It was old, the leather cracked, laces missing. It looked like it had been sitting there for years. I nudged it with my foot, then kept walking. A few minutes later, I saw another. Then a torn backpack, slumped against a tree. It was faded, weathered, but it hadn't been there long enough to rot completely. I crouched down, unzipping it carefully. Inside, I found a rusted can opener, a flashlight, dead, and a tattered rain jacket. No wallet, no ID, just abandoned gear. I felt a twinge of unease. People don't just leave their packs behind unless something stops them from going back for it. I should have turned around, but I didn't. The trail dipped into a valley, where the trees grew massive, their branches weaving together to block most of the sunlight. It was darker here, colder. That's when I smelled it. Rot. The sharp, unmistakable stench of something dead. I slowed, scanning the underbrush. A few feet off the trail, I saw it. A deer, or what was left of one. Its ribs were exposed, the body torn open. But it wasn't just the decay that bothered me. It was the way it was positioned, like it had been dragged there and left on display. I've seen dead animals before. Nature is brutal, but this felt deliberate. I swallowed hard and kept moving. The smell faded, but the silence deepened. Then I heard it, a rustling, soft, distant. I stopped. Nothing. I scanned the trees. No movement, just shadows. I kept walking. By the time I reached my planned campsite, the sun was setting. The area was open, near a small lake. Normally, I would have felt at peace here, but something felt off. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and ate quickly. The food tasted like nothing. My stomach was too tight, my body too tense. The silence pressed against me. No insects, no wind, just stillness. I forced myself to sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my tent. I held my breath. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, something pressed against the fabric of my tent. Not a hand, not a paw, something solid. I gripped my knife, staying completely still. Minutes passed. Then, nothing. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting, listening. Eventually, I must have drifted off. When I woke, the sun was up. My fire had burned out. I stepped outside, scanning the ground. No tracks, but I knew what I heard. Something had been out there. I packed fast and started moving. Going back should have been easy. It wasn't. The forest felt darker, the silence heavier. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh ones in the damp earth. Someone had been following me. I didn't stop, didn't drink water, just moved, fast. Then, The boot, the same one from yesterday, but now it was in the middle of the trail. I hadn't touched it before. I knew I hadn't. Someone had moved it. I kept going. Faster. The silence was crushing. No birds, no wind, just my footsteps. Then a head movement, a shape deep in the trees. Tall, still, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I moved faster than I ever had before. By midday, I should have been back near the main trailhead, but the path didn't look right. The trees seemed different, the land unfamiliar. I checked my GPS. The screen flickered, then went blank. Dead. I pulled out my map, but nothing made sense. Panic started creeping in. I wasn't lost. I couldn't be. I had followed the same trail back. Hadn't I? Then I saw it. The same valley, the same rotting deer. I had gone in a circle. My chest tightened. I turned, walking faster, trying to find my bearings. Then, a sound. Not footsteps, not rustling, breathing. Right behind me. I ran. I didn't look, didn't think, just ran.
Branches tore at my arms, my legs.
My lungs burned. I didn't stop. Somehow, by sheer luck or instinct, I burst onto a road. My car was there. I didn't question it. I jumped in, locked the doors, and peeled out of there so fast my tires kicked up dust. Only when I was miles away did I finally look in the rearview mirror. The road was empty, the forest still, but I knew someone had been there, and they had been watching me, and if I hadn't run, I don't think I would have made it out. I have always been careful. I plan my hikes meticulously, every route, every backup plan, every piece of gear packed for worst-case scenarios. I don't take unnecessary risks. I don't push past my limits. That's why, in over 10 years of solo hiking, I've never had a close call. Never had a reason to feel real fear out there. Until my last hike. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day loop in the mountains, cutting through remote backcountry where few people ever went. The kind of place I loved. Untouched, silent, miles away from civilization. I had studied the map for weeks. The trail was old, unmaintained, a forgotten logging road that faded into game paths and dense wilderness. It was perfect. I packed light but smart. My tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a full water bladder, and a filter for refilling in the streams. My GPS, my map, my compass. My knife. I always carried my knife. I left my truck at the trailhead early in the morning. The dirt road leading there was rough, barely passable, and there were no other vehicles in sight. That didn't surprise me. This wasn't a place people came often. The first few miles were easy. The old logging road was wide, the footing solid. The trees were dense, towering pines stretching high into the sky, their trunks thick and rough with age. The air was cool, crisp, the scent of damp earth and pine needles filling my lungs. I felt good. By midday, the road had narrowed into something wilder, overgrown with thick brush, the ground uneven with roots and fallen branches. I had to slow my pace, picking my way through carefully. That's when I saw the first sign that something wasn't right. A tree, stripped of its bark in long, jagged strips. Not claw marks, not weather damage. These were cuts, deep, deliberate, carved with a blade. I frowned, stepping closer. The exposed wood was pale and fresh, untouched by rot or time. It hadn't been done long ago. I looked around. Nothing. Just the trees, the thick undergrowth, the silence of the deep woods. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an old hunter marking his way, maybe just some bored camper with a knife. Still, unease settled in my stomach. I kept moving. The trail became harder to follow, twisting through thick brush, the ground uneven and littered with fallen logs. My progress slowed. Then I found the second tree, another carving. This time a shape, a spiral etched deep into the wood. My breath caught. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, the thick undergrowth beyond the trail. Nothing. but I felt it, that heavy, pressing stillness, the kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. I kept walking, faster now. The sun dipped low, shadows stretching long across the forest floor. I needed to find a place to camp. I found a small clearing near a creek. It wasn't ideal, too open, too exposed, but I didn't have a choice. The terrain ahead was rough, and I didn't want to be stumbling through it in the dark. I set up my tent quickly, my movements tense, controlled. I didn't build a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I forced myself to eat, my stomach tight with unease. Then I crawled into my sleeping bag, my knife close, listening. The forest was silent, too silent. No insects, no rustling leaves, just that heavy, suffocating stillness. Then, sometime deep in the night, a sound. Soft, slow, footsteps. Not an animal, not random movement in the brush. Someone walking. I held my breath, my body rigid. The steps stopped just beyond my camp. Silence, then faint breathing. I stayed still, gripping my knife, my heart hammering in my chest. Minutes passed. The breathing stopped. The steps retreated. I didn't sleep. The first light, I packed up fast and started moving. I didn't follow the trail. I cut through the trees, bushwhacking my way east, toward the logging road that would take me back to my truck. I moved fast, ignoring the burn in my legs, the ache in my shoulders. I just wanted to get out. Then I found the cabin. It wasn't marked on my map. It was old, half-collapsed, the roof sagging, the walls warped with age, and the door wide open. I stopped, my breath shallow, my pulse thudding in my ears. Something was inside, not someone, something. Bones, small ones, animal maybe, arranged in a pattern on the floor. A spiral. I turned and ran. I ran until my legs screamed, until my lungs burned, until my body begged me to stop. I didn't stop. Not when the trail disappeared beneath me, not when branches whipped at my face, not when my pack caught on thick brambles, yanking me back like grasping hands. I ran until I saw the break in the trees. The road, my truck. I stumbled toward it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys out. I didn't look back. I started the engine, floored it, and didn't stop until I hit pavement. I never reported it. Who would I even tell? I don't hike alone anymore, because now I know out there in the deep woods beyond the trails and the maps, someone is watching, and they never left.